Sewing closures. So first I'm going to start out with buttons. There's a variety of button types out there, so it's important to distinguish the difference between them. There are shank buttons and non-shank buttons. Shank buttons are the buttons that you're probably familiar with that are round. Sometimes they have a decoration or a stamp on top. And then underneath, they have a small metal or plastic stand that has a little hole through it. And the hole is what we will sew and attach to our fabric. That's a shank button because the shank is attached. A non-shank button is the button we're probably most familiar with, which has holes in the top of the button and is typically rather flat. Sometimes the back side is a little rounded and there's an indentation on the top of the button. So before you sew, it's important to distinguish the front and the back of the button so that you sew them on the correct direction. Some non-shank buttons have 2 holes like this one does here and 4 holes like this one does here. They sew on almost identically, although the 4-hole button does have an extra step to it than the 2-hole button does. So we'll start out with our our shank button instead of our non-shank button. The shank button is probably the easiest to sew, the most straightforward. Depending on your application, if you can get to the back side or the wrong side of the fabric and sew through all of the layers of your fabric. So if you're sewing this onto a shirt or a coat, going through as many layers as possible is wise. Sewing it to a thin 1-layered garment is not as wise because there's not a lot to keep that button stable. So multiple layers is better. In some situations, we add a small facing, a piece of fabric, and interfacing, which attaches to the fabric to strengthen it and give it a little bit more support. So I'm going to put my needle on the back side of my fabric and find the location that I wish to put my button and put my needle straight through. I will also add that I am sewing with a double thread. You can see that there are 2 threads running through, and that means that I put my thread through the eye of my needle, made the ends of the thread the same length, and tied them together as one. You do want to sew your buttons and your closures with at least a double thread, if not a quadruple thread. And quadruple threading would mean that I'd insert 2 threads into the eye of the needle, bring them all down together so I had 4 threads running through, and tie those together in a knot. Now I will put my button on by running the needle through the shank and then letting the button sit on the surface of the garment. And when I begin to sew back into my fabric, I want to go back down into my fabric as close as I can to the location that I started. You do want to point your needle toward the same area when you're sewing on a button so that you are concentrating the thread on the back side of the garment into one spot, into one location, so that we don't have threads jumping back and forth in a large pattern across the back. Now I will come up through once more. Again, staying as close to the button and the original location as possible, putting my needle through the shank. And then back down. So basically, I'm going up through my fabric, through the shank, back down through the fabric, and then repeating the process again and again. So the thread is making a continuous circle. I'm going to complete 5 to 6 of these continuous circles through my button to make sure that the button is secure and stable. So now I've completed 3. That's 4. 5. Back down again. And I'll do one more just to make sure it's all the way secure. So again, I've concentrated my threads close together on the back side. Okay, when I've completed this last rotation, then I'm on the back side of my garment, and I'm going to make another stitch, then grab a hold of my loop, and there will actually be 2 loops there. Do treat them as one like we did with other stitches. Put your needle in, wrap it around, and then gently pull until all the thread is at the base of the fabric before you clip it. And then you can see the button is securely attached to my fabric.